Here we are in my studio, which is a building that was built as an electrical substation and readily adapted to reuse as a sculpture studio. I work here primarily welding, fabricating out of metal, various metals, bronze, Corten steel, stainless steel. And I've been here since 1971.
Could you please describe the progression of your work? Where did you begin? What you're doing now?
Well, in terms of my work's progression from, where should I start? Well, I guess from the beginning. I mean, as a young kid, I liked to draw and stuff like that. Then later on, going through grammar school, high school, I started to do more of various kinds of art. And finally, in high school, I took sculpture class, which sort of the idea of working three-dimensionally was more exciting than working two-dimensionally. In the early days, I was working in modeling in clay, plaster, things like that. Just in terms of background too, I grew up in Chicago, went to Chicago public schools, and then at a certain point when I was like 7th or 8th grade, I started taking classes in the junior school at the Art Institute. And in high school, I ended up taking a sculpture class in this junior school, which is what got me started. As I mentioned, working mostly modeling in clay, maybe using plaster. And then I ended up going there to college and continued to do sculpture. During that time, I think it was either the freshman or second year, I saw an exhibition at the museum called Sculpture in the 20th Century. It was a survey of sculpture up until, this was the 50s then, and featured work by people like David Smith, Julio Gonzalez, various other sculptors from Britain and other places who were working directly in metal, that is to say welding, fabricating metal. And most important was the work I saw of Julio Gonzalez, who had come at the same time Picasso did, from Barcelona to Paris, and worked there. And as a matter of fact, they were friends. And Gonzalez helped Picasso do some of the welded iron things he did, like the Monument to Apollinaire and various other things. And found his own, special style, Gonzalez did, in working directly in that method himself. He'd had a background in blacksmithing and metalworking back in Barcelona. His family were metalsmiths. They worked on the Sagrada Familia and all kind of other things. But anyway, so he was somebody who was able to really kind of usher in, through his association with Picasso and beyond, this idea of working directly in metal, and a technique he called the marriage of material and space, as a exploiting the tensile strength of metal, the possibility of positioning it here and there more freely than you would with traditional materials that you either carve or model and then have to support some way or other. And interestingly, David Smith saw his work in Paris in the 30s, late 30s, and was taken by it and started to work in that direction, as did many others. And so there I was, seeing this work at the Art Institute, and I said, I want to do that, which I sort of, in the various steps, proceeded to do. I first started to make things out of soldered wire. Well, I took a class in metalsmithing, which was more like decorative metalsmithing. making jewelry, bowls, stuff like that. But like I say, I started to actually make what I call sculptures out of soldered wire, and then went on to get a welding torch, oxyacetylene welding torch, and move on to other things. And I've been doing that then for another 50 years. Yeah.
Your miniature wax maquettes are part of your process in creating large-scale work. So how do you come to this process, and what other rough drafting techniques do you use or have explored? And what appealed, this idea of using wax specifically for your sculptures? Like, how did you come about that?
Yeah. Well, while most of my work ends up being welded metal, I do work with wax in a couple different contexts. One is to develop scale models for larger pieces. Another is actually just to do smaller works that are sometimes addition, but more often cast as unique pieces. But I use sheets of wax that I might cut to the, in terms of scale, a ½ inch equals a foot, or an inch equals a foot, or even a ¼ inch equals a foot. I'll cut sheets of wax to a certain size that might correspond to a piece of metal 4 feet wide and 8 feet or 10 feet long, or 20 feet long, depending on the scale of the project I'm thinking about. And so one can cut the wax into shapes. Well, first cut them into sheets of a certain size, then cut it into various shapes that one can use a soldering iron or even the pressure of one's hands to put it together. And one can take this wax that I tend to use, Victory Brown microcrystalline wax, and warm it up so it becomes more pliable so you can form it, that sort of thing. So anyway, it's a way, as a matter of fact, I've described it as sketching in 3 dimensions. I do make every now and then little sketches of ideas that are going to be enlarged, but I like to do it 3-dimensionally because the thing's going to be 3-dimensional anyway.
Great. And what about like difficult pieces? What would be if you ever had like a piece that was you'd really wrestled with, it might have taken you a long time. I think the question is, what was your hardest piece over the years?
Well, when I think about work, degrees of difficulty or ease or whatever, well, there are various things that one might describe as difficult or challenging. It may be a large piece, it might be just something technical or logistical, how to place something over here and something over here and not have it fall down on you or what, But then there's the whole thing about conceiving something and developing, while you know how to put things together. There are challenges that arise with certain things that require a kind of unique, say, positioning of something in relationship to something else. I'm thinking about particularly large pieces, something that hangs from a ceiling or projects out of a wall. And so, as a matter of fact, some of those problems are problems you need various kinds of support. That is to say, well, actual support, but going to others, structural engineers or people like that, or there may be some over time advances in techniques. I mean, instead of cutting out things with oxyacetylene torch, cutting out with a laser or water jet or something, because one thing doesn't distort the water jet since you don't use heat. it doesn't distort the material, etc. So I mean, there are any number of things that are just part of just moving along in one's career. You solve some problems, others arise, but on the other hand, you get more used to it, and it's all part of a day's work.
You know, the students noticed that you had a lot of African sculptures in your space, and they were curious about the connection between that and what you're creating now. Like this kind of continuum of craft and making. So we're wondering if you could talk a little bit about this and talk about maybe how this affects your work, and if there was any particular objects or sculptures that have like maybe a stronger connection, I guess, to this, the work that they've seen, this African sculptures here.
You know, my work over the years has been influenced by any number of things. You know, I've talked about, you know, my style, which is, you know, direct metal, fabricated, welded sculpture. And one of the things that, talking about various influences, you know, specifically the influence of African art on my work, I mean, it turns out I collected, I mean, like, over the years, well, I started collecting some pieces in the middle to late 70s. But then I started to see pieces that were made out of iron, well, you know, also bronze and all. But I got particularly interested in the ones made out of iron. For one thing, they reminded me of some of Picasso and Gonzalez, David Smith sculpture. And as a matter of fact, for instance, David Smith collected some of the same things. And I was looking at a book, showed his studio at Bolton Landing, you know, and there were some of these iron throwing knives on the wall, which reminded me of some of his tank totem sculptures. Which brings me to talk about the fact that, you know, all of modernism was influenced by various kinds of tribal art, in particular African art. But, you know, the art that was discovered, you know, in Europe, France, Germany, and all, from all the other cultures that represented some of the places that had been colonized by those people. And it's well known that Picasso and all this, they go to the Musée de l'Homme, and they even collected all these things. So, anyway, you know, I have certain things around in the studio, but I also collect other things like Piranesi prints and a few other kinds of things like that. But so there's an interest in a whole range of things. I mean, just if you walk around here, you see all these African pieces. But you know, if I had some of my prints, Piranesi, the other old masters around, they'd be all dusty, or a spark might get on them and burn them up.
Right.
But on the other hand, I'm just saying that there's, you know, there's all of that to, and not to mention the fact that one collects what one can. I mean, if I had all the money in the world, I'd have a few other things around the studio and elsewhere in my collection. But certainly the connection for me with well, just the whole history of metalworking in Africa is interesting. Because a lot of people think about African art, they think about things carved with wood, raffia hanging over cowrie shells. But you know, going back to prehistoric times, there's evidence of work being done in metal in Africa.
And the last question, it has a little bit more to do with your inspiration and how maybe you contextualize yourself with other artists. The question was, or is, describe how you look at art when you go out to galleries and museums. Where do you go to see artists, or where are your favorite places rather that you go to see artists in town, maybe even internationally? And if you can describe a specific experience you had viewing the work of another artist that you really respected, and how did this affect you in your own practice? It's good.
Well, when I think about looking at the art of other artists, either my contemporaries or art from other periods, there's several things come to mind. I mentioned earlier this show, which was probably the most important show I would have seen in my career, in that it gave me the idea, the inspiration that I could work directly with metal instead of modeling and carving and things that were traditional and part of what you might call the course of study in sculpture at the time. As a matter of fact, that just brings me to say, that when I was a student at the School of the Art Institute in the college from 1953 to 57, in the sculpture department, they had one oxyacetylene welding torch that they used to weld together the armatures that they would build things up in clay or plaster on, not to make sculpture, drawn in space or whatever, like what I saw Picasso and Gonzalez and David Smith doing in that Sculpture of the 20th Century show. And then, I would think in an artist's life, there are things that they'll see at a certain point in time that give them a direction or point them in a direction. And of course, earlier on, when I was modeling, I was interested in Rodin or, people who model things in clay. As a matter of fact, but then fast forward to next week, I'm going to New York, and I'm looking forward to seeing the show that's at the Metropolitan Museum of the French sculptor Carpeaux. He was active around the same time, a little earlier, but he had this very deft way of modeling just fascinating. I didn't know of his work earlier on, but even after I started to work with metal, I saw that, and I was just very interested in the way he modeled both. It was just very natural. So that the things, like Rodin's modeling, his Age of Man was certainly realistic in what you might call the extreme, because people thought he cast it from life. But on the other hand, Carpeau's work was just even more dexterous and presented gesture, expression in a way that was just very engaging, I guess. So anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing that show. Now, it doesn't have anything with what I'm going to come back and do, I don't think. I might come back a changed man, but I don't think so. But on the other hand, it's interesting to see a retrospective of his work and to see real things. I've seen a lot of his work, but to see real things, that are brought together in a way that you wouldn't see them otherwise. And of course, then there's just the shows you go to just keep up with what's going on. Some work I might like and some I might not like, but I'm interested in what other people are doing and all that. Just going to galleries, whether it's here or there or somewhere else. And then there are things that you might want to see. It's worth taking a long trip to go to see. and every now and then I've been able to do that. Well, speaking of the use of space, it was a long time ago, but I made a trip to India, where I'd seen pictures of these rock-cut caves, and I wanted to see the Jhana caves, and then there were ones I didn't know about, like I ended up going to Ellora, where you think about things carved in stone, in the kind of Western tradition, cathedrals and stuff like that. And then you go and see that they sort of carved out the side of a mountain, created this thing, and they've gone inside and carved everything out of the inside. It's just interesting about thinking spatially, how you could do that. Not to mention all the time it took and how you'd organize to bring something like that about. But anyway, so there are these different things that an artist sees over time that has real profound effect. Yeah. So.
Do you have anything else that you would like to add or talk about?
Yeah, and I also have one other follow-up question, which is, hey, maybe I can combine these two, but I'm curious to know what's the next big thing for Richard Hunt? I mean, what are you working on now? Like, I'm just excited to hear about, what's next for you.
At this point, I've got a lot of little things that you see around the studio that I keep thinking, I'll put a few hours in and finish that up, or finish that up. And one thing to be said too is that it's easier to start a sculpture than finish it. So, and then as time goes by, there's more things that I've started and not finished. So, whereas 20 years ago I might have had 4 or 5 pieces that were unfinished, now I have 25 pieces that are unfinished. And it seems that it's continuing to go that way. So ask me next year, I might have a better answer. But then, so there's kind of finishing up things that I've started in the studio, and then I'm starting to work on, like I think I mentioned, that I work on some large-scale pieces in various kinds of welding, fabricating places. So I'm going to be working on a large piece for a park in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is dedicated to Romare Bearden, who was a friend of mine, one thing like that. And so I'm interested in doing that, and a piece kind of an homage to him that I call Spiral Odyssey. And then a couple other pieces. Going to start to work on something for building on the campus of the University of Iowa, a music school, which I like doing. Since I like music, I like making sculpture go in a music school building. And, like that.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Mr. Hunt.
That was excellent.